All right, guys. So this is Amy Loughren, and I'm so excited to interview her today, mostly because I feel like she started out just like me, or just like most grocery members, as just a woman working in the hospital, just trying to go to work every day. You're a nurse, you want to take care of people, and your life took a super crazy turn. And I'm sure most people here know who you are, but we're just going to go through some questions to see how you got where you're at today. Um, so first, let's start off by talking about you're an ICU nurse in 2003 and you're working at Somerset Hospital in New Jersey. You know I live in New Jersey, right?
No.
Yeah, I do. And it's crazy because this story, when my mom had read the book that was written about your story, and my grandpop was at one of the hospitals during that time period. He was at a Sacred Heart hospital, but that wasn't in the it didn't seem like that was in the investigation, but it was on Charles Cullen's timeline of when he worked there, when my grandpop was there.
Wow.
So my mom thought that that was kind of crazy. But all right, so 2003, you're a single mom. How old are your girls?
My girls at the time were 6 and 11.
Wow. Okay. So I'm
hmm
just trying to set the scene of like what your life was like during that time. And you're a single mom, and how old were you about when that was happening?
So I was in my late to mid 30s. So it was 20 years ago. So I was 37, 36, 37.
Okay. And you're working at this hospital, ICU nurse, and you make friends with a nurse that works there named Charlie, you call him. And how did he start working there after you, or did you meet him? Like, how long were you working there?
I am terrible with chronology. If we asked the writer of the book, Charles Graeber, who like has this intense memory, I always go back to him to say, "Wait, when did I do this? I don't remember." But it was let's see. So 2003, I believe he started working with me in 2001. 2002. So we had already been working together for, I would say, a year and a half.
Okay, cool. And it's just I want to talk about this because I think that what happened with you could really happen with anyone. And I worked in the hospital and made such best friends with people that I'm still friends with today, you know.
Yes.
So I mean, when you're at work with people, you're with them sometimes more than your family even. So you develop relationships with people. And so just briefly tell us, you don't have to go into a ton of detail because I'll ask you more questions in more detail later, but just what happened that made your life all of a sudden not so ordinary when you went to work? You're working with this guy, you were friends, and
Yeah, so we were super close, and he and I were close on that level where he was like my work husband, and we made sure that our schedules were together so that we could make sure that it was just he and I and one other nurse. We used to call each other, or people called us the Three Musketeers. And then I got a phone call that said he was fired. Now, mind you, he was the best nurse. He was amazing with patients. He was just the best in codes, and everyone used him as a mentor for medications, and he was our go-to guy. And I was told he was fired, and I think it terrified everyone that if Charlie could be fired, then all of us could be fired.
yeah, that would freak me out too because you think this guy, if this guy's the best, or and you, of course, at the time had no idea what was going on, so I could see that you were probably freaking out as a single mom that you were going to lose your job because
Yeah, absolutely. And because we worked so closely together, at that time, I didn't know why he had been fired. All I could imagine at that time, the only thing I could imagine is maybe he was fired because of narcotics, because there was also talk that there were police and detectives in the hospital after he was fired asking questions. And so, to me, as a nurse, the only thing that really would make sense is it must be controlled substances. Like, that was the only thought in my mind.
And did you when you heard he got fired, did you call him right away? And
So yeah, it's interesting because back in the day, it was just starting to be like cell phone days. And so I did not have his phone number in my cell phone. And so, and after someone gets fired, their phone number gets taken out of the system. So I couldn't even call and get his phone number. So I waited until I got to work, and then a bunch of nurses covered for me because everyone wanted to know what happened with Charlie. They covered for me so that I could call at work, so that then I could tell everyone what happened with Charlie. So I actually called him from work and stayed on the phone with him for like an hour, hour and a half, with everybody kind of taking care of my patients. And Charlie and I had a very, very tearful conversation about why he was fired. And he explained to me that he was fired because he had lied on his application. And he admitted to me that he did lie on his application. And it didn't make any sense why, after so long of him working there, would they fire him for lying on his application, and what would have transpired for them to look back and say, this isn't right. He had previously been fired from his jobs, two of his jobs, and he did not disclose that on his application. So that was the truth. He was fired for that reason. He didn't disclose to me that he had also been interviewed by people because there were suspicions that there were suspicious deaths that he may have been connected with.
now so you're at the hospital, obviously you have a supervisor and stuff like this is why I think it's weird that the supervisor wouldn't pull you guys into the office like that day and be like, "Yo, like this is going down right now," right? So what like how did you start finding out what was actually going on? Cuz obviously the whole theme of this is that the hospital was trying to keep it hush hush, and I could tell you about a situation I had similar later with the whole risk management crap, but we'll talk about that later. Um, but yeah, I think that like what happened that you guys, all the nurses on the floor, started figuring out like what was really going down.
Well, the detectives, there were several detectives that were pulling nurses in and having conversations with them about, specifically about Charlie, and then specifically about me, because I found out later on that the detectives were asking questions about me to kind of throw people that they already had their guy. They already knew that Charles Cullen was the person, but because they were up against what was happening with the hospital, kind of covering things up, they did not want the hospital to realize that they already knew that it was Charles Cullen. The hospital had given the detectives the wrong name already, and to try and throw them off the case. But I was told that they were asking questions about me. And so, of course, all of the nurses on the floor were also avoiding me. Like,
Oh my
like something was happening with me as well. And I was like, oh my God, like nobody wanted to talk to me. Nobody would like meet my eyes. And I just kept saying, I'm not talking to the police. Like, I'm not doing it. And then I had a risk manager tell me that I didn't have a choice and I had to talk to them. So I was the very last nurse to be interviewed by the detectives. And the lead detective was the only person that was allowed to talk to me. He didn't want the other detectives to have access to me because he knew that there was probably some information that I would have that no other nurse would have, because during their investigations, they realized that I was very, very close with Charlie.
Yeah, I could see that.
So yeah. So during that interview, right before, the risk manager essentially coached me in what to say, and she was going to be right there, and that if I had any questions, just to have her answer them, and that she was there for me. And so when I went in, I assumed that the hospital was going to help me and that they were supporting me. And that wasn't the case at all. They were trying to throw anybody under the bus so that they could save their own asses.
I was thinking that too. How gross is that? That they're trying to say to the, you don't need to talk to the police. Like they're trying to protect you from the police. That's weird, right?
Yeah. And because I had never been through anything like this, I mean, I had never even read detective novels before.
Yeah.
Like I was like, well, of course they're going to help me. You know, I work
Yeah,
for
you're a
a
mom and they
hospital.
write your paycheck. So,
Yeah, of
oh
course
my
they're here
God.
for me. Like, I mean, I was so naive. I was so naive. And essentially, she was making it sound like I should really be afraid of the detectives. And luckily, she got called away during my interview with Danny Baldwin, who was the lead investigator. And of course, I am such a strong personality, and right out of the gate I was like, this is bullshit. I have absolutely no idea why you're asking questions about my friend Charlie. He's an amazing nurse. And later on I found out that Danny was like, yep, this is our girl, this is
Yeah.
our girl.
Yeah, because you stand up for your convictions though, and people like can see that in you.
Absolutely. And I was like, you're essentially going to have to come through me to get to Charlie. So when the risk manager left, Danny decided to lay his cards out, and he did. And he showed me the Pixis printouts, Charlie's Pixis printouts. And there were a couple things on there that I noticed right away. Number one was the amount of cancellations that showed up on the printout. So essentially, Charlie was going into the computer, into the Pixis machine. And if people don't know what a Pixis is, it's like a cash register for medications. You type in someone's name, a drawer opens, you take out a medication that you've asked for, and you close the drawer, and then it records everything. It records all of your actions. Charlie would type in a medication and the drawer would open. And at that time, um, when the drawer would open, there were all these little cubicles of multiple medications. So he could essentially go in and type in peroxide for a specific patient. And right next to the peroxide could be a deadly medication that he could just scoop up and take out. So no one would really understand that unless they knew what was in the Pixis. It looked like it was such a normal thing. He would type something in and then cancel a transaction, but still take out a medication.
And normally that cancel function is only used if you make a mistake, so you wouldn't
Correct.
normally see so many cancellations.
Yes, correct. And so I saw that first. And the other thing that I saw, and I I don't remember the exact amount, but it was nitroprusside that I saw. And normally, nitroprusside, we use a tiny little vial. And that tiny little vial, we then put into a bag of medication. And we use that bag of medication over 24 hours. And we only need this much for an entire 24 hours. Well, he took out and did not conceal this. He took out 12 of those medications in one transaction. So there would be absolutely no reason to do that. There's no reason in medical history that you would do that unless you were making 12 bags of medication for 12 different patients. It just didn't make sense, except that there was something sinister going on.
So for me, so I never worked on the floor. Obviously, I have no idea about any of this stuff. This is kind of eye-opening to me because I can't believe that there's not some kind of system in place that would alert anyone that this was happening or would
Right?
even allow. Yeah, it's like
Right.
mind-blowing to me.
And that's what I said too. Like, so even in that moment, and mind you, this was 3 minutes in my mind. I'm flipping through, and my mind goes two ways. Number one, if the hospital does see this and they saw this and didn't do anything about it, there's a problem. Though the other part is, what if they didn't see this? What if
Yeah.
they're not even checking to see what is happening with these medications? And uh, both of those answers sucked. Both of those answers put everyone, every single patient in danger. And my paradigm inside my head, like I felt like I disassociated. Like I was like, for one, it was very obvious that Charlie was doing something sinister. And two, it was obvious there were some serious issues with the hospital that I was working at. And I just like, I felt completely trapped, like just like in the movies where your vision just starts to like come into this pinpoint. And I was like, what the hell? Like, what is happening?
Yeah, I wouldn't, you almost don't even want to believe it because you're like, there's no way that this is happening right now. And it's, and I just noticed it kind of, like
Yes,
a
yes,
huge
exactly.
burden on you. And then you have this fear of like, do I want to say something because what if I'm not right? And then I lose everything.
Exactly. Am I jumping to conclusions now? I'm just being shown something. What if somebody's trying to frame him? Like so many things are going on in my head all at once, and I just can't think. Like it's just too much all at once. Tell me about your experience with the risk manager.
So I was in charge of all the deaths at a hospital that I was working at. And when someone had some very high profile patient died during a procedure, and that's considered to be a reportable death. Like I have to call the ME and say, hey,
Mm-hmm.
this happened. Sometimes the ME will say, well, you do it and I'll look at the death certificate, or I want the body. So when I called, and I so happened to know the ME because I did my internship there, and I called them just like, hey, I have this case. And I did this all the time. This was like an everyday thing because a lot of people die at the hospital every day, right? So I called them and I was like, hey, I have this case and this patient died. He exsanguinated during a procedure. And I want you, do you guys want to take the case or whatever? And he was like, yeah, I want the body to come here and I'm going to do the autopsy. So he does the autopsy and he rules it an accidental death instead of a natural death that would be at the hospital. And the family wanted to sue the doctor and this and that because the thing happened during a procedure. And I don't think it was the doctor that was involved was a very good doctor. I don't think it was like some kind of sloppy acts. It's just sometimes things happen when you get procedures done. And the guy was
Yes.
older and he had all these health problems. And risk management came down And I dealt with them a lot because I worked in pathology. So it's like we just had to deal with them a lot. People want to take home this or this, I was on the phone with them a lot. And I knew the people, and they came downstairs and like came in my office and locked the door and was like, "You need to tell us why you would call the medical examiner on that case." And I was like, "'Cause
No.
that's what you do. That's what you do." Like I never was trying to like start trouble. Like I just was, because I felt like if I did the autopsy and didn't call the ME and then the family brought
Right,
the
right,
forth, I would get in a lot of trouble for doing that and not letting the ME know. So I just always did things like to procedure, what I was supposed to do.
right.
And they were like, oh, a lawyer's going to come interview. It was the same thing. Some lawyer came and interviewed me, but like the risk management person was sitting there the whole time. And this is what you're going to say, the coaching and all. And then
Yes.
after that, it was like I was in charge of doing all the autopsies, all the deaths, and all of a sudden it was just like, well, we're going to let other people do some of your jobs. And I started getting retaliation. So, of course, being young, stupid, naive, I was in my 20s when that happened. I went, or my early 30s, same age you probably were when this all went down. And I go to human resources, who's there to protect me, and say, my boss is doing this and taking away my job responsibilities ever since this happened, and thinking that they were there to protect me, and they basically were like protecting the hospital.
Yes.
And it worked out for me because I ended up getting pregnant with my middle child, and I was like, you know what, I'll just go get another job and leave or whatever. But it all went bad for me doing the right thing. But I feel like they were mad that I didn't try to cover something up for them, basically. So
Wow.
yeah, as soon as I started seeing that, there's a lot of things that, even though I'm not a nurse, it is like kind of mind blowing about your story. Because another thing that I want to say is like I've done so many autopsies, and it's the same thing. Like people just die, right? They unexpectedly die all the time. They don't know why. And a lot of times we do the autopsy and you're like, just we don't know, we still don't know why they died, right? Like you can't always tell. And I'm thinking, if it from my perspective, like, and that was one of my questions for you, was when that one nurse called poison control and said that this patient had high digoxin levels, and like is that a medication that you normally monitor the levels by taking someone's blood?
So there were a few things that were happening at Somerset. So we were, every single morning, we would draw our labs on our patients, and we would get phone calls every single morning for a certain period of time where all of our patients were having blood sugars that were in the teens. So I remember having one particular patient, the blood sugar was only 6.
Wow.
So, and there was no reason. This patient was not on an insulin drip, was not diabetic. So
Yeah, that's
something
so
was
weird.
going on, and initially everyone was thinking that it was the lab. And so there kind of started a pissing match in between the nurses and the lab. Like, there's no way this has got to be like new machines in the lab, or something's happening with the lab. So when everything started showing up with that, they started to put our insulin in the Pyxis, so that we had to now count our insulin as if it was a narcotic. They knew then that someone was harming patients. They already knew. And so digoxin, unless someone is on digoxin, they're not going to test for digoxin. So Charles Cullen used that medication specifically because it was a deadly medication, and unless you were looking for it, it's not going to show up. Whereas blood sugar shows up because we always
Because it's
draw it
routine, yeah.
on, yes. Yeah, if you are drawing labs, it just the glucose automatically comes up.
Yeah, and that's
So
why I was asking, because like when we do a normal hospital autopsy, we would never that's why I was so shocked, because I was like, we would never test for that. Do any kind of postmortem toxicology. So like as far as that goes. But yeah, like
yes,
glucose would show up obviously because that's in the
yes.
regular blood work.
Yes, so you
Interesting.
have to like, and it really made sense that he started using digoxin because it's not going to show up.
Yeah, so this whole thing where they try to say that this guy was doing like mercy killings or whatever, just exactly like he thought this out. He really thought this out, and and that's another reason that makes me think that.
And I think also, so much of this, for a long time, I wanted to believe that he was a mercy killer. And I wanted to stay in denial that he was a mercy killer. And actually, until I saw the documentary that was done by Tim Hawkins, I really never saw his confession tapes. I was there during the initial part of his, 9-hour confession, but I was not allowed in the room. So I hadn't seen any of it until I saw the documentary. And the way that he was talking to the detectives and doing this like hunched over sort of fetal position,
Yeah, that was so
crying,
weird.
he was so performative. Like he normally in life and as his friend, he was always extremely unemotional. And I finally was able to let go of that guilt because I was always questioning myself like, well, maybe he really was trying to help people. And I just assumed because I wanted to put that smoking gun in his hand. And so when I saw him, it was just so blatantly clear that he was either two different people and that he actually believed it, or he was being performative. And Tim Hawkins in that documentary shows you his performance with the detectives, and then he shows you who he is in the courtroom, where he is completely blank. He shows no emotion. He does not give even one moment of empathy to the victims' families, and is actually showing who he really is, which is he never cared about those people that he murdered. He just wanted people to believe that he was a hero.
What was his deal? Because they didn't really touch on that too much in the documentary, as far as he was divorced and had kids.
So, yes. So, in Charles Graeber's book, he does it so beautifully. He was actually able to interview his ex wife
Oh wow.
and also interview the, um, the people who had investigated him several times, many years prior. And she explained how he was abusing animals. Um he had already been in that like state of mind of poisoning. And she was able to at least get away from him after the second daughter was born, but even her, she was really taken in by his performative self. And she even said that it was very hard to distinguish between who that person was, the murderer, and who her husband was, and this caring father. Um, he was married, had 2 children. She left. He did have visitation with his girls. And that was really the commonality between the two of us, also, is that we both had 2 girls around the same age.
Did you ever hang out with him outside of work, like just day trips with the kids or anything like that?
So I lived 3.5 hours from that hospital.
Oh,
So yeah, it's very interesting the way that Christy Wilson Cairns wrote the movie. And I'm actually very glad that she wrote it the way that she did, because it's very hard for people to understand how close you get when you're in the medical profession, when you're a team. And yes, I was closer to him than any of my other friends at that time, because we just spent so much time together and doing things, traumatic things together. You bond like soldiers. Um, and so she couldn't really show that. And the way that she showed it was to make it even more believable how close we were, that he was in my home. But no, he never, we never did hang out together outside of work until he was fired. And then, of course, we did because of the investigation. But I would have. And if I did live in New Jersey full time, then yes, I definitely would have had him over at my house. I definitely would have done, you know, things outside of work with him, probably with his girls.
and did he talk about like I mean, obviously you were friends with him and nothing was ever weird. I'm just thinking like in hindsight, like did he talk about his divorce and his kids and then um like why he got divorced? You know what I mean? And then now maybe you look back and say, okay, obviously you could see why his wife was really knew him and that's why she left him, but
He was very self-deprecating, so he would, and he was actually very funny. And he would often talk about what a shitty husband he was, and like make up these scenarios to talk about, well, not make them up, but share these scenarios and put a spin on it about how he was just a terrible husband. He never talked poorly about his ex-wife. He would talk poorly about, at that time, his current girlfriend, but he never talked poorly about his wife. And he definitely was, he was trying very hard to put forth this persona that he was honest. And in many ways, he was. He would tell extreme truths so that I would not question when he wasn't being truthful.
it's has anyone ever done any kind of analysis on him to see if he does have some kind of personality disorder or has he ever gotten a formal diagnosis that you're aware of?
No, and he has been very verbal about not wanting to speak to anyone about that. He does not want to be a lab rat. He doesn't want to, and I also think that he's very afraid that someone would give him a diagnosis. And at least prior to all of this coming out, he just still wanted his daughters and me and his sisters to believe that he was a mercy killer, to believe that he really did care about his patients, and he wanted to still hold on to that persona. And that's typical narcissism, sociopath,
Oh yeah. I mean, he's
psychopath. He
definitely got a lot of those.
Yes, I mean, he checks all the boxes, but he's so charming, and you can get sucked in very easily when you're talking to him because he's so likable. And even though you see him, like if you've seen the 60 Minutes episode, people are like, oh my gosh, he looks so creepy. But he had already been in prison for like a decade by that time, and he was just like, he had no son, and he turned into like this Nosferatu kind of character, like he shrunk into himself. But prior to that, no, he was actually on that verge of being a tall, handsome dude. And and he was charming, he was well spoken, his voice was very captivating. So yeah, it was hard to not get sucked into feeling almost sorry for him.
Now, after he got arrested, so you go through all this help with the police to get him arrested. He gets arrested. You're still working there during all this time? Like how'd that go down?
So he gets arrested, and that's really odd as well, because he got arrested. I wore the wire, we were in the restaurant together, they do a takedown when we leave the restaurant, he's taken to jail. I'm like, whew, I'm done. Whew, all done. Wow, woohoo, he's in jail, we're done. And 2 days later, I get a phone call from the detectives that said, so, yeah, so he's not really talking, and we kind of had an issue with some of the wiring, and we didn't really get a true confession out of him. So essentially, the wires malfunctioned.
Oh my
So
God.
So they asked me to go back in, and I'm like, oh my God, now I have to go back in to talk to this murderer. And so I go back in. There's, an entire like drama filled day of me talking to him for hours that day. And we do finally get a full confession out of him. And I then have to go back to work, and it's in the papers that Charlie is now in prison for this, and I do not I cannot leave my position to go to another position because of my insurance. I had cardiomyopathy, and I was also still under, excuse me, I was still under my contract with with the travel company. So if I left and had something done, had a procedure done for my cardiomyopathy, I would not pass a medical exam to be able to work again under this particular company. And I probably then wouldn't have insurance. So I really needed to stay in this position. I could not afford to leave that position. And I had to kind of work out my contract to be able to still have insurance. So I was kind of trapped there for a while.
And
And
did they I mean, I just can't imagine this. Like you're off work a couple days and here you're working for detectives and doing this. It's in the newspaper and you just go back to work and they know at this point, right, that you're involved with this, I'm assuming, or
so
maybe not.
no. So I believe that there was some understanding that I might have given the detectives some information, but no, my coworkers were really still very suspicious of me because I was really good friends with him. And the people that were running the hospital now, they have suspicions that I was working with the detectives. So I was kind of off limits at that point. And I also kind of got a little bit drunk at the Christmas party and threatened the CEO. So it turned into like this weird kind of bad Amy thing, and I was a little bit naughty in that sense. But
Well, what this is actually, I'm more pissed off about the response to his actions rather than his actions himself themselves. Thinking about like none of the hospitals involved with any of this had any kind of disciplinary action whatsoever. It's just like life is normal, right? Besides
yes.
bad publicity, basically.
Yes. And yeah, like we had been talking about the whistleblower thing, and it wasn't a nurse that was a whistleblower, it was a pharmacist who called poison control.
Oh, okay, that's
So
interesting.
the pharmacist called poison control, and it was really poison control who pushed the narrative with the heads of the hospital that they had a criminal problem on their hands, that there were patients being murdered. And not only did the hospital know that there were patients being murdered, they also figured out pretty early on that it was Charles Cullen who was doing it and left him on the floor. They
Eh,
left him and did not take him off the floor, did not fire him, did not suspend him. And after talking to Dr. Marcus, I believe Dr. Marcus from Poison Control, um, it was it was shown that there were between 5 and 8 patients that died under Charles Cullen's hand after the hospital already knew that he was murdering people.
I can't believe the families don't have some, they can't get together and do some kind of.
So they did.
Oh,
So they
okay.
did behind the scenes. There were civil suits, and those civil suits also had gag orders on them. Now, I don't know that for certain. I do know, however, that the civil suits ended, and that was why I was able to talk to Charles Graber, and that's why the good nurse could come out, is the civil suits were already done.
Okay.
And prior to that, the really no one knew who I was. No one knew. They knew that there was a confidential informant that was within the hospital. And Charles Graber found out that there was in the paperwork, there was just a CI. I was referred to as a CI throughout the paperwork in the investigation. So that's how he went looking for me.
So that's really cool. So this happens in 2003, and then from 2003, and then the book came out in 2007. You were just
2013.
Oh, 2013. Okay. And then,
Mhm.
oh, sorry, he wrote an article about you in 2007, right?
So he wrote an article about Charles Cullen. He went to see Charles Cullen. Charles Graber worked with Charles Cullen because Charles Cullen wanted to donate a kidney.
Okay.
So Charles Cullen once again comes on the scene and wants to be a hero. And the warden will not let him donate a kidney. And so Charles Cullen goes up against the state of New Jersey
Oh my
to
God.
be able to be a hero, to be able to donate a kidney.
Yeah. Okay.
And Charles Graber writes about this. And
Oh,
then
okay.
because he has so much information and had spent so much time with Charles Cullen, that he realized that this was a book. Once the book was pretty much completed, then he started looking and seeing that there was a confidential informant, and he really had this gut feeling that there was something missing. Like there was some portion of the book that he knew that there was something going on, and the detectives really protected me right all the way through. Charles Graber eventually heard and I think I remember this story correctly, but the detectives, Tim Braun and Danny Baldwin, were receiving an award for their work on this investigation. And when they received the award, they said this goes out to Agent Amy. And that's when Charles Graeber was like, who's Agent Amy? I wonder if that's the CI. So long story, but he found me through Facebook, and then I was given permission to talk to him after the civil suits ended.
That's cool. And then so then the book comes out, and what's the response? Because now your first and last name is now out there that it was you. And you're working as a nurse, so were you like a little scared that maybe a hospital wouldn't want to have you because you had already been a whistleblower kind of thing, so to speak?
I was really actually very worried about that. And I had already been remarried by that time. My name was Amy Ridgway.
Oh, okay.
And so at least I didn't have to worry about it that much. But the book came out, and there was like this initial, like, big response to the book and to the 60 Minutes piece that they did on The Good Nurse, the book. And they had an interview also with Charles Cullen in 2013. And so, yeah, I was very concerned, but the initial buzz just kind of went away. Like, it was there, it peaked, and then it was just gone. So I just went right back into just the
Regular
background.
life. And then all of a sudden, so then when did you find out that Netflix was interested in this story?
So I knew that Lionsgate was talking about buying the rights to the book. Darren Aronofsky, who did Black Swan and The Whale and Noah, he picked up the book, fell in love with the book, and then had Christy Wilson Cairns come on board to write the script. And Christy spent a lot of time with me, a lot of time with Charles Graeber. And so we were working on it for quite some time, but I kept thinking, it's not going to happen. Like, I mean, there's a lot of people trying to develop projects out there. It's not going to happen. I just kept thinking it's not going to happen. And yeah, and it just kept rolling along like really slowly for years until I was in Fiji. I was actually on a women's retreat in Fiji, at a meditation retreat, and I saw an article come out that Netflix had bought the rights, and that Eddie Redmayne and Jessica Chastain had signed on. And I was like, wow, this meditation shit really works.
How wild is that to think about like a famous movie star playing like you?
Like,
Was that
what?
like a crazy feeling?
It was, I think it felt very much like I was in a movie, in my own movie. Like, wait a minute, somebody's going to be playing me. Like, how many times in people's lives do they say, hey, if somebody was going to play me
Yeah,
in a
right.
story of my life, I certainly probably would have picked Jessica Chastain.
I know. I mean, it's such an like it's so flattering, it's awesome. So, how has this obviously this was a life-changing event for you, and your life was already hard. I mean, because I used to be a single mom, so I know that it's hard to be a single mom. It's already hard. And then you had all this stuff happen to you. How has how has that changed what you're doing now? Because tell everyone a bit about like what you're doing now with things and your theory on life after that whole thing.
So, really, what happened with me after all of that was I for one, I was fighting for my life. I was told I really had a deadly illness, and
Actually, I did want to ask you about that as well. Like what you had cardiomyopathy. How old were you when you started with that and got diagnosed with that?
so I'll give a very, very brief overview. I actually had a car accident in 1993.
Okay.
So I was 27, 28 at the time, and fractured my sternum,
Okay.
uh, clavicle, sternum, ribs, and they found that I had what they believed was a cardiac contusion. And so they did a bunch of tests, and it just didn't go away. Like, I kept having heart issues, and then because I was working night shift, I really just kind of ignored it until I couldn't ignore it anymore. And then I was told over and over again I was just stressed out, like they do a lot with women and heart issues, until I eventually went down at work, and I had, uh, I think it was like a literal, they caught it on a monitor. It was like a 10-second pause.
Wow.
And I was diagnosed with sick sinus syndrome, and they followed that for a while. And I eventually ended up being diagnosed with an electrical cardiomyopathy, and I had a pacemaker put in. The pacemaker really didn't work. The defibrillator didn't really help me much. And so they told me I really needed to go on the transplant list. And so during all of this time, I was actively seeking medical attention for going on the transplant list. So I was already stressed out with working 16-hour shifts. I was working with the detectives. My found out my best friend was a serial killer. um Being a single mom, plus I was directing the sixth grade play at the time as well. Like, I had a lot on my plate during that time. So after Charles Cullen went to prison, I really went to this really, really deep place of just trying to save my life. I ended up having surgery, a life-changing surgery in 2005, which was really just meant to, the Cleveland Clinic was just trying to keep me off the transplant list as long as possible. Um, and I decided that I needed to figure out why I befriended a serial killer. Like, the 1 in a million chance that I would have started working with Charles Cullen, I just knew that there was some type of divine intervention there. There was just this just couldn't have been happenstance. So I started taking workshops and following this quest of trying to figure out my own darkness. And within that time, I started receiving what I would consider access to gifts. I believe that they're gifts that everyone has. I don't think that I'm unusual. I had many, I had spiritually transformative experiences, and I now use those experiences to help other survivors of trauma. And I am also working on a special project now with Charles Graeber to talk about all of that, to talk about my quest and where it brought me. And I now use those things. I'm a Reiki master. I worked with these spontaneously enlightened gurus that helped me with meditation practices. And now I teach that to other people. It took me 20 years to get where I am. And I also realized, well, probably 57 years to get where I am. But I also realized that there are techniques that you can allow, at least offer people, that they don't have to spend 20 years going on a spiritual quest. I can give them techniques that they can use daily where they don't have to do anything different and make these intense changes to be able to go on a deeper quest within themselves. So anyway, in a nutshell, that's what I'm doing now.
It's really cool because when I'm listening to your story, I find that this is a common theme that happens in a lot of people's lives, that you can go through a lot of really bad things, and then if you're strong enough to get through it, things could end up turning out really well for you. But a lot of times people just go down the rabbit hole, and it gets worse for them. But there are ways to turn it around kind of and make your life what you want it to be. So I think it's a good thing you're doing. It's awesome.
I agree. And I think that that quest was definitely to try to understand myself. And the way that I have been able to download that information and to be so grateful for everything that I went through, I think it's very hard for people sometimes to even envision forgiving their monsters, because I believe that everyone has loved someone dark. I believe that every single person, whether it's someone in their family or someone that they were involved with or someone within themselves, they have loved someone dark and don't understand why they do that, and don't understand that you can love someone dark and still hold them accountable. You still can hold yourself accountable.
And did you find that you were having problems uh being angry? It almost seems like he had to you were saying he had like a performance, and maybe your whole entire friendship with him was his performance, because I do think that when you see him in the courtroom, it is like a dead behind the eyes. I mean, the things I'm listening to these people say to him, there's just like no emotion in his face whatsoever. I don't even know how you would turn that off if and
So, yeah, and that's a beautiful observation. And I had to really come to terms with, was he the person that I thought that he was? Was he that friend? Did he actually care about me? Or was the murderer the real person? And the friend I thought I had, was that the performance? And after seeing him in the courtroom, after seeing that and watching him, I believe that's who he is. I believe that the murderer is the person that he is. And the performance, that masking, that pretending to be part of society, I think that I think that the person that I believed him to be never existed.
yeah, I really think so too after watching that. But it's almost something you can't take to heart for yourself, because it seems like other people that you worked with, no one really suspected that he was the way he is. And now in hindsight, people watch these interviews and say, "Oh, he was so creepy looking. How did you not
Yes,
know?" And you're like, "Come on,
exactly.
obviously he wasn't like that when you were working with him, or you would have been
Exactly.
like."
I was like, no, he was such a cool dude. He was so much fun.
Yeah, and every patient would be like, "I don't want that creepster in my room taking
Oh
care of my
my God,
parents."
yes. And if he actually looked like that, like if I saw him and he looked like that and he had like that
Exactly.
weirdness, I would have definitely been like, dude, what is wrong with you? And no, I would be like, why did we hire this creep?
Exactly. Because everybody's also known a person that you're like, they're really weird. You know, you hear that sometimes, but clearly this guy was completely not like that. He's a good
He
actor.
definitely, yeah, I would say, Nicole, he definitely had an energy about him that was confident. And he he probably was like a little bit depressed, maybe, but for the most part he was just so smart, and he had a little bit of a smugness about him. And yeah, I mean, he was nothing like that. And I fell for the mask. I did.
Yeah. And apparently everyone else did too for years. It's such a crazy story. But you've made such a great thing out of it. I love it. It makes me so happy because a lot of people would have just ignored stuff or just not want to get involved, and you really put a lot on the line, your own life, but for your kid. I know what it's like working because I did that with my daughter, and it's like you have to put up with a lot of shit because you need that job to pay for your insurance and to pay for your kid to go to school and everything. So you really took a huge risk, but it was worth it. And I think the families are probably so thankful that you did that too. I mean, did you ever actually get to meet any of the families of the victims?
I had met a couple of the families, and yes, I mean, they were just wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And actually, a couple of Charles Cullen's family members reached out to me as well.
Oh well.
And they are so grateful that someone could stop him. And I think that was probably the most emotional note that I had ever received. And knowing that his family did understand that he still needed to be held accountable and that it was okay that they left him. It was okay.
That's so amazing. Well, we're doing a lecture together in Florida on what day is your lecture on? Do you
I am the caboose. I am the very last lecture.
This was awesome, and I think the gross room members will just be so happy. Most of the people in the gross room work in a hospital or in the medical professional, so I think they'll all really be able to relate to this because everybody's had work best friends, trust me. So I think your story is awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nicole. You're awesome.
Thank you.